turning them to Genesis 39, we're reading the whole chapter. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "why, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties. None of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. And then she told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard this story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. Now, does it matter to you what people think of you? Of course, it can matter too much. It would be easy to just constantly adapt how you come across to people depending on who you are talking to. And doing that kind of thing can make you a very shallow person, can't it? But if it doesn't matter at all to you what other people think of you, then you're probably not a very nice person to be around. Not least because you'll say things without being bothered what other people think about what you say, but also because you probably won't take care of your personal hygiene either. Not very nice to be around people like that, is it? Now, to some extent, what people think of us does matter, to some extent. It especially matters if you're an employee, if we have a boss, as we will see with Joseph. But what about God? What does God think of us? And does that matter to us? Well, we've rejoined Joseph in this narrative. He's been sold off as a slave by his brothers. He's been sent to Egypt, where he's been bought by this guy called Potiphar. And Potiphar has some kind of position in relation to Pharaoh. He might be responsible for the prison. He might be responsible for the kitchen in the palace. He might be responsible for both of those things combined. And that would explain elements of the story that go on. But since then, since he's been sold off to Potiphar, we've had what has happened with Judah, as we saw last week. It's an explicit story. You can read it If you missed it last week, you can read it in your own time or watch last week's sermon on YouTube. That story highlights the way that sin takes control over our lives, the way that we can fall into further and further sin. And it also shows us how we need to be confronted with our sin, seeing how bad it is in order to be saved from it and forgiven by God. There's another reason for the story that you might remember from last week, not only in that Judah needed redemption, but also that it sets it up as a backdrop for what is about to happen with Joseph. So with all that said, let's dive into this story. It has three main movements that happen, three scenes, if you like. So scene one, we see the blessing, where Joseph is in favor with God and in favor with his master. So we meet Joseph in Egypt, described immediately in chapter 39 as prospering. In fact, it says in verse 3 that he does well, he gets success in everything that he does. Have you ever met one of those people? Just everything that they turn their hand to, they're successful at it. It doesn't matter what they're trying to do, they're just the absolute best at it every time. Those kinds of people are so annoying, aren't they? Well, Joseph is a bit like that. There we are. I wonder if we'd find him a bit annoying like his brothers did. Well, Joseph has been given all of these smaller roles in Potiphar's household. And Potiphar just notices that no matter what he's given, he does it really well. No matter whether it's cleaning out the cattle or sweeping out the rooms, cleaning the kitchen up, Joseph thrives at his job, and he's given more and more responsibility as time goes on. Perhaps he oversees one slave, he does well at that. Now he oversees two slaves, he's good at that. Potiphar just puts him in charge of everything. And the only thing that Potiphar has to worry about with Joseph in charge and running everything so well, the only thing he has to think about is actually eating his foods. Sounds like an easy life, doesn't it? But why was Joseph successful? Why did he prosper there? Well, we have to go with what the Bible tells us. And the answer in these verses is he was successful because God was with him. He was in favor with his master Potiphar because he was in favor with God. So let's look at that in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. So the Lord was with him so that he prospered. In fact, in verse 3, it's when his master sees that the Lord is with him that he then finds favor in his master. And it's since the Lord is blessing Joseph with success that now he's then blessing Potiphar as well. So there's that knock-on effect. We see that in verse 5. So from the time Joseph was put in charge of the household and of all that Potiphar owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Now, if you're really on the ball here, if you've been reading through Genesis as a whole book and paying very close attention, you might remember chapter 12, a really pivotal chapter in the book of Genesis, where God promised to Abraham that his descendants would be blessed so that they would then be a blessing to other nations. And this is a little version of that. It's one of Abraham's descendants being blessed first of all because he's prospering in everything that he does, but then being a blessing to the nation around him, to this Egyptian. It's a little taster of Genesis 12 already being fulfilled. Now, we all want God's blessing, don't we? We'd all say yes if it was offered to us. But what I want you to pick up on is that Joseph doesn't just sit back and wait for that blessing to come. He gets on with what he's supposed to be doing, and it's as he gets on with what he's supposed to be doing that there is then blessing for him from God. So, for example, in your workplace, if you think, I'd love to be blessed and thrive in what I'm doing here, it's no good just sitting back and resting on your office chair and saying, I want God's blessing in this. You've got to actually get on with the job, haven't you? You've got to get up at your desk and type. You've got to teach the class. You've got to be on the conveyor belt as the items are coming through. In school, if you're in school as a pupil and you want to be blessed in your work, there's no good not doing your homework or not listening to the teacher and expecting God to bless you. You've got to get on with the work, haven't you? And it's in getting on with the work that God might choose to bless us. So if we want God to bless us in something, well, we've got to get on with what we're supposed to be doing. And it's in getting on with it that God might then choose to bless us. Now, there's no promise of success in this. This is not some prosperity gospel that if you have enough faith, if you pray the right kind of prayer, then God is bound to bless you. And if he doesn't, then obviously you haven't had enough faith or something like that. That is not what I'm trying to say at all. But if you are in favor with God because you are one of his people, then you'll want to work then according to his ways. And when you do work according to his ways, then you're more likely to succeed in your work. So, for example, if you're working hard at a particular job, if you're committed to it, if you're devoted to your work and putting in the hours, which is what the Bible encourages us to do, to work as if to the Lord, then that might get you noticed by those that are responsible for you. And then you might be given opportunities for promotion, or if you're a pupil in school, of privileges within the school. But I want you to see, even more importantly than that, how this points to Jesus. You see, in so many ways, Joseph is a picture of who Jesus would be. Now think of Luke's gospel account very early on, where it speaks of Jesus' childhood and where it says that Jesus grew in favor with God and with other people. Now, does that not accord with this? Does it strike you that Jesus, even though he was God, he still grew in favor with God? That is something that is incredibly profound. So think of him as a spirit-filled human being, himself divine, yes, but he was accomplishing God's work. He was doing the ministry that he'd been called to do. Think of the crowds as they saw what he did, and they said he does everything well, growing in favor with other humans. Think of the words of the Father speaking from heaven at his baptism and at his transfiguration, saying, "This is my Son, in him I'm well pleased." This speaks of Jesus, doesn't it? And as for us, well, God's favor being upon us, it's not because we earn it or deserve it. We don't deserve to have God's blessing upon us. But it's because we are those who have turned to trust in Jesus, who follow him. And when we follow Jesus, we're described as being in him. We're so connected to him. And that means that everything that Jesus deserves is ours. He deserves God's favor and blessing, and he credits it to us. Well, let's go on to scene 2, where we see Joseph resisting, and he is in favor with God, but out of favor with his master. Now, if we thought people like Joseph were annoying enough, he's not just successful, but he's also a very attractive person. They're the worst, aren't they? People who are good at everything, but also just incredibly good looking. And his boss's wife even, she notices that he is incredibly good looking. She fancies him. And so she tries to get him to sleep with her. The sexual temptation is there, the bait is set, the trap is there, ready to jump upon him and trap him. And it's not just as a one-off. This is something that she does time and time again. She persists in trying to tempt him. As verse 10 gives it, day after day she speaks to him. She entices him to come to bed with her. I'm sure most of us will know sexual temptation of one kind or another. It's all over the place these days. I was actually, perhaps a couple of years back, I was on a website for studying the Bible. and an advert came up with a scantily clad woman on it, on a website for studying the Bible. Now, it wasn't the website's fault. It was just Google ads. And it wasn't an advert that was trying to advertise something Christian either. But it's still pretty shocking, isn't it? You're trying to do something, reading and studying the Bible, and then there's a sexually explicit, toned down, shall we say, advert, but still something that is sexually enticing. Believe me, the advert got a report on that occasion. But the temptation can come in all kinds of forms, can't it? It's there on the internet, but it's there on TV when we look at celebrities that are there. We might have fantasies that we imagine in our minds. We might see people from time to time, and perhaps our mind wanders and we just imagine what it would be like to be with them instead of who we are with, or something like that. We might even just be reading a novel and just find the lust there in our mind. The traps that the devil sets are numerous, and like Potiphar's wife, they come upon us day by day. So what does Joseph do? With sexual temptation there, he resists. But why does he resist? Well, his explanation is in verses 8 and 9. He refused. He says, "With me in charge, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one is greater than in this house than I am. My master has not withheld anything from me except you, because you are his wife." So he points out to her that he's got control over everything in the house, but there's one thing that Potiphar hasn't given to him, and that's his wife. So she's off limits because she's someone else's husband, and she's just not been given to him in that sense. But then he adds something else. Right at the end of verse 9, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against who? Against God." There Joseph is upholding the biblical ideal, that it's one man, one woman in exclusive, belonging marriage. Open marriages are not God's intention. Affairs are not God's intention. Sex before marriage is not God's plan. So the high point of his explanation here is that he cannot sin against God. Yes, he's concerned about upsetting his master and doing the wrong thing before him, but even more so, he's concerned to honor God. He's in God's favor, and so why would he sin against God? He knows God's favor, and so he cannot sin against him, and so he resists. He resists day after day. He avoids her whenever he can, until one day they're on their own in the house, and he says no, but she grabs his coat and holds on to it, and he leaves it behind. In fact, where it's translated cloak, it could well have been his shorts or even an undergarment, and that would look even more incriminating. Do you remember a couple of chapters ago how Joseph was explained to be missing to his father? Joseph's father was presented with an item of clothing. And now the wife of Potiphar, she has an item of clothing that she is going to present in order for a verdict to be passed about what has happened to Joseph. So it's Potiphar's wife's word against Joseph's word, except that she has some supporting evidence. Potiphar gets home. He's fuming. Joseph has fallen out of favor with his master. He has been captive as a slave. Now he's captive in prison. Now, how do we see Jesus in all of this? Well, the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way that we are, but he was without sin. He remained untainted by sin so that he could be the one who takes our sin upon himself. It's the only way it would have worked. Just as Joseph was without sin and yet suffered, so Jesus, without sin, being tempted in every way. But we also see how he fell out of favor with other humans, how Jesus fell out of other humans. Obviously, they all shouted, "Crucify." They all called for his execution. And yet at the same time, Jesus knew he was doing the will of his Father all the way through. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he reflected that this was God's will that he was following. And we're told that he was obedient even to the point of death. You see, sometimes when we do the right thing, it will provoke others to fall out of favor with us. It will bring us trouble. In school, you might be the person who never gets in trouble because you're always doing the right thing, but other people get jealous of that, don't they? And then someone might frame you for doing the wrong thing, even though you didn't do it. Or in the workplace, though you're hardworking and honest, someone might blame you for their failing to their boss, and their boss might believe them rather than you. Doing the right thing will sometimes put us out of favor with others. It can even get us into more trouble, which we see in scene 3, where Joseph is suffering. He's in favor with God and in favor with his master, again, we could say. Now, it's interesting that the master, Potiphar, he doesn't have Joseph executed. He would have every right to. If he really had tried to sleep with his wife, then he would be perfectly within his rights to have Joseph executed. But instead, he's just put in prison. It may be that Joseph has earned enough favor with the master that even though he thinks he's done this terrible thing wrong, he still doesn't want to have him executed. Or maybe Potiphar knew what his wife was like. Maybe he saw through his wife's lies. But he still has to save face in society. Rather than having a promiscuous wife and the shame of all that, he simply puts Joseph in prison. Whatever is the case, he is suffering. Joseph is suffering, but the fact that he's not executed is a sign of God still keeping Joseph for the plan that he has for him. Joseph is in prison. He's suffering as an innocent. He's suffering, but not because he's done anything wrong. He's suffering innocently. But even though he's out of favor with Potiphar, he is still in favor with God. That has never gone from him. And how do we know that? Well, because the end of the chapter goes in the same kind of way as the beginning of the chapter. Do you remember right at the start, God blessed everything that Joseph did and gave him success? It happens again. It happens in prison. And so you've got the warder giving Joseph a little bit of responsibility. Do this little thing for me. And Joseph does it really well. And so the warder gives him even more responsibility, the odd job here and there. And he does it really well until we see, this might sound familiar, Joseph being responsible for everything in the prison. And the warder having to pay no attention to anything else because Joseph's got it all. That's what it says in the last verse. The reason being, again, that Joseph works as if to the Lord, and so he knows God's blessing in all that he does. Again, thinking of Christ, as he faced his suffering, he did so knowing that he was in favor with God. As we've mentioned, just before he died, he recognized that this was God's will for him. He was obedient even to death, even to the point of suffering. And it's in that suffering that he experienced, that we then experience love and forgiveness. And so his suffering, his innocent suffering, is precious to us. As we go the way of Jesus, we will go through times of suffering. Sometimes that suffering will be as an innocent. We will experience hardship. We will sometimes have false accusations levied at us. We'll experience physical suffering. But as we suffer, we hold on to Christ. We hold on to all that he has accomplished for us. But notice that it was through Jesus' suffering that human favor began to come to him again. What do I mean by that? Well, look at how people turned to him and recognized who he was because of his suffering. Look at the centurion who saw how Jesus died and recognized This is the Son of God. And since then, how many people have found themselves favored towards Jesus because they recognize he suffered on their behalf? We are among them. We who have trusted in him, we have recognized that his suffering brought our forgiveness, brought our adoption as children. We don't earn favor for ourselves, but we find it in Jesus. So look, we're not always like Joseph, are we? Joseph in his resisting of temptation and sin, we're not always like that, are we? More often than we care to admit, we're not like Joseph. We don't always resist. Maybe we have given in to sexual sin in some big way. Maybe it's an ongoing struggle for us. Maybe some other kind of sin is really weighing upon us. We may struggle with all kinds of other sins and all kinds of other temptations that we fail to resist where Joseph succeeded. But for every time that we have sinned and do sin, we have one who is greater than Joseph, one who did resist every temptation that came his way, one who never sinned, even though he was tempted in every way as we are. We have one who suffered horrifically, even though he was innocent, because he was dying for our sin, to bring about our forgiveness and to set us free. And so for all of our sin, for all of our failure to resist, we have Jesus who takes away all of our sin. What's more, we have his Spirit to bless us, to empower us to battle against sin, to resist those moments of temptation. We have God's Spirit within us. And what's more, he's given us each other as well. He's given us the church. And if you are struggling with a particular sin, if you're struggling with sexual sin, it might be worth talking with myself or with another Christian that you trust. Very often when we bring sin out into the open and have another person to help us in dealing with that sin, sometimes that's the best way to deal with our sin and with our temptation. But what does God think of us? Remember, that's how we began. That's the question we left hanging. What does God think of us? Well, as his people who have come to be in Jesus, as we follow the one who is greater than Joseph, we become his children. We become those who he set his eternal love upon us. He shows us his favor so that we are always in favor with God. Joseph was never out of favor with God. Jesus certainly was never out of favor with God, not truly. And we too, if we're set in Christ, if we follow him, we are in favor with God because of what Jesus has done for us, because he has earned it and then credited it to us. What good news we have.